All right, good morning and welcome again to Cronkite Global Week. It's Hump Day here and we're so glad to get to network with all of you who are in person and those who are online. Thank you for joining us. Today we have an outstanding group of Afghan scholars here at ASU. The Afghan Scholars Program is a joint initiative launched by Future Frontlines and the Fellows Program at New America following the events of August 2021 in Afghanistan to give voice to the millions of Afghans displaced by endless war and grinding poverty. Following an in-depth review of almost 300 candidates from at-risk and in-exile Afghans, 6 scholars were selected for a chance to augment their professional skills and networks and build their portfolio and publications. The scholars are recently displaced Afghan nationals with a demonstrated commitment to peace building, good governance, and the defense of human rights. During the 8-month initiative, the scholars will participate in a semester-long investigative journalism program where they will continue to report about Afghanistan and provide evidence-based analysis for international stakeholders. To introduce them, please join me in welcoming Candace from New America to the Cronkite School. Please introduce yourselves and take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Candace Rondeau. I am a professor of practice with the Center on the Future of War here at Arizona State University and an occasional guest lecturer at the Cronkite School, as well as the director of the Future Frontlines program at New America. For those of you who don't know what New America is or what we do, it's a think tank and a do tank, we like to say. We've had a long-standing partnership with Arizona State University for about 8 years now. And the idea behind this partnership is to try and build the kind of fiber and sort of connectivity between Arizona and the policy community in Washington, and more specifically with all the very talented school faculty and staff and students who come from Arizona and who bring so much to the table when it comes to thinking about the future of foreign policy and national security in the United States. I'm very pleased to be here today with our Afghan scholars. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the program and its origins. For those of you who also don't know me, I spent about 5 years living and working in Afghanistan, first for the Washington Post as a bureau chief, and then for the International Crisis Group, where I spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the political situation and security situation in Afghanistan. Along the way, I made a lot of good friends and of course, built a lot of personal bonds as well as professional bonds in Afghanistan. And I have since continued to work on Afghanistan in various capacities, including at the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, where I was one of the founding members of the Lessons Learned program. The motivation for the founding of the Afghanistan Observatory was really because of that origin story, my own personal connection, but also our colleague Awista Ayub, who is Afghan-American and runs the Fellows Program at New America, also was very personally invested in seeing and ensuring that Afghans still have a voice, despite the fact that today, I think the world is sort of starting to forget about what is happening there and the challenges that still lay ahead for some 40 million Afghans. We really felt it was very important also to give a voice to the many folks who have been working behind the scenes, in some cases for decades, to support newsrooms around the world, especially the New York Times, the Washington Post, newspapers that you read all the time, Wall Street Journal. All of those newsrooms had staff, sometimes numbering in the tens, and thousands of people in those communities were displaced in large part because of what happened with the collapse of the Afghan government. There has been a tendency in, support for Afghanistan, particularly in the humanitarian community and the international community, to really privilege elites in Afghanistan who have worked for the Afghan government. And I feel very strongly, while that is important, now is the time to really champion the voices and the people who have been working hard to defend human rights in that country and outside that country. And so I'm very pleased to welcome today our scholars. First, let me introduce Sumaya Tora, who has many, many credits, but I think probably one of the most amazing credits is that she is Afghanistan's very first Rhodes Scholar. She is based in Oxford, and she has had a long, illustrious career working in the humanitarian space. And she continues to do so, helping support Afghan refugees and the community at home with resettlement and also aid. My colleague, Ali Adili, actually also happens to be a neighbor. Our offices were very close to each other in Kabul, in the Taimani area, in Kali Fatullah area of Kabul. He was a former country director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network, which is an essential guide for understanding what's going on in the country, and has been a truly important resource on policy developments in Afghanistan for many, many years. And then to my left, I have Fahim Abid, who worked for the New York Times as a reporter for many years and distinguished himself in coverage of many major events, not the least of which, of course, was the famous bombing of the Tolo News Network journalists who were targeted. Now, I think it was like 5 years ago almost. There are many, many different events that Fahim has covered, but he has distinguished himself incredibly with his coverage of day-to-day events in Kabul and outside of Kabul. And I think there's very few people in this world who know as much as Fahim does about why the Afghan government collapsed and why the security services perform so poorly. We will be exploring all of these issues together as a team. There are actually 4 other fellows who are probably watching online right now, so we're just saying hello to them, who also have distinguished themselves either as journalists, human rights defenders, as professors in major universities, and we're very, very proud to have them with us. I wanted to start our discussion today. We're going to try and keep it conversational and also open up the floor for Q&A a little bit later in our discussion. But I think it's important to set the stage and kind of contextualize where we are right now with Afghanistan. August 15th is a day that most Afghans probably will remember, much like 9/11, in the sense that it was a thunderclap for the entire country. And it has, in many ways, that day set off almost a reverse reconstruction that now is taking place in Afghanistan. We have one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Almost 75% of the country now cannot afford to eat or find food. Water is in short supply, drought persists. And this means that the Afghan people will continue to suffer as they did before. But unfortunately, now that the US is no longer there and its NATO partners have departed, attention is starting to wane. And this is a very precarious moment for the country. And at the same time, we have Taliban leaders making very difficult decisions, I think, that are beginning to impact the entire country, particularly around women and girls' education. That has become a real barrier to progress on receiving humanitarian aid and negotiating humanitarian aid in the country. So I want to turn to our fellows and see if we can kind of get their perspective on what all this means, what the current situation means for Afghanistan, and kind of start there, maybe work our way back to look at the origin story of the roots of this crisis that we find ourselves in. So Samaya, you spent a lot of time kind of transiting back and forth to Afghanistan in the final years of your career. And you have family, of course, that has been impacted. But tell us a little bit about how you see the situation in Afghanistan now, vis-a-vis human rights, and in particular for women, but also I think for ethnic minorities in the country.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. And thank you for the lovely introduction. Yeah, so I was actually, maybe I'll take us back 2 weeks before the collapse, August 15th. So I was scheduled to go back and fly back to Kabul 2 weeks before the collapse to actually start working at the Human Rights Commission office. And I was intending to return back. At the time I was working at UN and I was monitoring, a part of our research was related to sanctions. And I was closely monitoring Afghanistan because they wanted to give me a brief briefing to some of the UN staff about the situation in Afghanistan. And I actually went through and I looked at the rates of casualties that, and New York Times did a really good job, which Fahim was involved with Fatma Faizi. They were at the front of recording the numbers of soldiers who are dying, but also civilian casualties. And I saw that those numbers were concerning and things were falling apart. And as I kept monitoring it over weeks, I started to realize that it's not a good idea for me to go back and maybe I should wait. And I paused, I canceled my flight, and I actually started planning to get my father out because I knew that there might be something going on. And fast forward, the state collapsed after 2 weeks and my father was stuck. And in that process, I was trying to get him out. Fortunately, he made it out. But there were so many other people who were left behind in the country. But then what started to happen was that as I was interacting with these families and working with them, slowly, it became very difficult for a lot of these families who I was working with closely, trying to evacuate them to, if they were in hiding, they weren't able to go out to, because obviously they're at risk. So they want to protect their identities and they don't want to go out and interact or get in any form of trouble. But slowly, with the sanctions, not being able to access their money, life became very difficult. So it not only became about security at one point, it became about survival. And that is what's going on right now, is that most Afghans, they're having difficulty even accessing cash, their own savings. And I was speaking to a human rights activist yesterday. I was in Boston, and she was telling me how she, for example, has not been able to retrieve her savings, but they're normal civilians who are out there trying to retrieve their savings and to be able to access. So there's a whole cycle of poverty that we're seeing, and cycle of the hunger crisis and the drought just makes the situation very worse. And with the current decisions that have been made on March 23rd, if you're following the news, you might know that the Taliban, they were supposed to open schools on March 23rd, and March 21st was this New Year, Persian New Year. So they even announced, the Ministry of Education announced on March 21st that they would be opening schools on March 23rd. Girls showed up dressed in their uniforms to schools. Some classes had started, and all of a sudden they were instructed to close down the schools. So you can only imagine how devastating it is for so many girls in Afghanistan right now that they were sent back home. And after that, I think Ali can give a debrief on some of the policies that the Taliban have been imposing, which is making life difficult day by day for women.
Yeah, I'm curious, Ali. One thing I think that's really hard to convey to people is this idea that school for boys and girls is an opportunity to socialize. I mean, it's literally, for many, their only opportunity to get away from the house, away from the kind of day-to-day pressures of not having enough food, the arguments that might take place between family members. It's actually like one of the few places that young people can find kind of a sense of privacy and agency. So when we talk about not being able to go to school, it's really important to kind of think about really what that means for them. But why? How did we get here with these policies, Ali?
Yeah, I'm grateful to the Cronkite School for having us here, and thank you, Candice, for the nice introduction. So I have been mainly involved in evidence-based research, so I would rather go through some of the policy notes that the Taliban have issued. First of all, there is no policy making process within the Taliban administration. That should be noted. And whatever we have is really the kind of guidelines issued by different government bodies and ministries. And as a result of these instructions, guidelines, or policy notes, we can see that there has been a massive reversal of the rights and freedoms that had been achieved in the 20 years during the presence of international community, including the US. So as I go through some of these policy notes, you will see how massive this reversal and rollback of the human rights and freedoms. Particularly, I will focus on women's rights because I believe that women is one of the most affected segment of the society nowadays in Afghanistan. The first thing is, we had a Ministry of Women's Affairs, and it has provincial departments across the country. Now, the premises of this ministry is housing the Taliban's famous ministry for promotion of virtue and prevention of vice. Of course, it cannot be ruled out that the symbolism of giving this Ministry of Women's Affairs to the ministry, to a suppressive body like the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, could be like characteristic of Taliban's misogynist attitudes. That is one point. And the second point, on November 21, Taliban's Minister for Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, Muhammad Khalid Hanafi, introduced guidelines for media. And in that policy note, he said that women journalists in TV channels should wear Islamic hijabs. Drama and theaters in which women play roles should not be broadcasted. So this is like restricting women's appearance in TV channels. And then on December 17, Taliban's Department of Virtue and Vice in Ghazni banned women and girls from entering health centers without a male chaperone or guardian. And similarly, there was a directive posted in one of the health clinics in Kahmar district of Bamyan, where they said that from now on, women cannot enter health centers without a male guardians or male relatives. And then on December 26, the Ministry for Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice issued a guidance note in which it asked taxi drivers and the drivers of other public transportations not to pick up female passengers who do not have like a proper Islamic hijab. And it also said that do not pick up women or female passengers not accompanied by male chaperone in a trip that is longer than 45 miles. So if people, women want to travel from Kabul to provinces, then they should be accompanied by male relatives or male guardians. So this is basically restricting the women's freedom of movement. And there was on January 24, the Taliban held 3 women who were without male guardian in Ghazni city. These women had been there to apply for passports, but they were without male relatives, and they were held for a few hours in a container in front of one of the provincial departments. And then on February 10, the Taliban's Minister of Virtue and Vice issued a letter to the administrative office and said that all female employees should wear Islamic and Sharia-based hijab. That is still like not so strict instruction. The second part was female clients. For example, if you need to go to a government agency and you need to have you have some work there, then you should be accompanied by a male relative. If you do not have a male relative, then you are not allowed to enter those government buildings. And then on February 27, the Taliban spokesman and Deputy Minister of Information and Culture, Zabihullah Mujahid, the famous spokesman, you know, told the press conference that women and girls cannot travel abroad without a male guardian. So this is basically, if a woman wants to travel outside the country, she should be accompanied by a male relative. Suppose if that is like increasing the cost of the travel, and also if male relatives are not free to go, then that is basically depriving women of the freedom of movement. And I would just mention the last part, the last or one of the latest guidelines that they issued. It was again Taliban's Ministry for Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice that issued a gender segregated schedule for parks. And that instruction was that Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday would be for women, and 4 days of the week, like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, to men. And it also said that if women go to parks, they should wear hijab, and the officials of those parks will be responsible if women do not wear hijab. I think it opens the way for abuses because it leaves the interpretation of hijab to those officials. And I also wonder that if it operates under the assumption that women do not need weekends, or if they need weekends, they do not weekends in parks. So in summary, I would say that all these guidelines shows that the Taliban have significantly restricted the public spaces for women. It includes government offices like health centers, universities, and public transportations, as well as parks.
So, I mean, I want to unpack this a little bit, and I'm going to get to you, Fahim. But one thing that I think is interesting about, that march through all these different edicts that have been issued is, it shows a progressive desire to control. And we were talking a little bit about this last night at dinner, sort of what motivates this desire to control women in their space. And I think the thing that struck me, I don't know if it was you, Samaya, or you, Fahim, who said, that Afghan men are used to having servants, right? And that there's this kind of implied assumption around that women are essentially chattel slaves, and they are manumitted to men. They can do nothing without them. They do all the kind of dirty work, the hard labor. They do the toxic jobs, and then they're also expected to continually serve the male men of their household, and anything beyond that, of course, is also haram, right? Forbidden. But this now is starting to have additional implications, I would say, for men, men who want to go to work, or who at one point relied on women, because of course there was a not insubstantial middle class that was starting to burgeon up, where women were teachers, they were becoming doctors, nurses, they had work outside of the home. So what do you think the economic impact is, if you can speak to that, but also your general impressions of some of the things that Ali has shared with us?
So thank you for having us here. The situation in Afghanistan is now like, it's a kind of prison for women and for most of the men, because there is someone who issues order on behalf of you, and they will go beyond, they won't stop here. Like, they will ask for more restrictions every day to just keep people under their control. And during this 20 years of war, and having been through the 40 years of war before that, we have got a lot of widows in Afghanistan. And if they can't do anything without a male companion, it means that they can't bring any food to their kids and to their family members. So that being said, most of these women are now like asking their relatives for help, or their family members provide them some food. But it won't continue for a long time, because the economic situation in the country is very bad. And as Ali was reviewing all these orders, in a country with 75% of its people below the poverty line, you don't see a single thing about how to improve the economic situation. You see everything about restricting people and restricting women. And it's the fear that most of the Afghan men unfortunately had in this 20 years, that if a chance is provided to women, they are way better in performing in government organizations, and even in businesses and in other affairs. So if you ask like Afghan men, most of them will say like, I can't cook anything. And that's not because they were able to afford eating out. It's because they were used to being served by their sisters, by their mom, or by their wife. And they never had a responsibility in the household. They would just bring money, and that's it. So in this 20 years, we have got like a lot of strong women and a lot of working women in our families. And they had a massive contribution to the economy of the family. In many cases, their contribution would be way better than male members of the family. And now that's gone. And in most cases, the male also lost their job. So like you can think about the situation when it's in a place where like 5 people were used to work in one family, and now only one of them works, or like he would do some vendor on the street or something that's not enough for the whole family. So this will expand the economical crisis in the country, and will make it difficult for those who are not part of the Taliban, because those who are part of the Taliban, they have income revenues. They can grab people's cars, they can grab people's money, they have some shares in the income, and there is no response about the government revenue, that where it's going. Like, yeah, the economic situation is bad, but still we have export like almost everything from other countries, and where is the revenue going? And the revenue has increased. Even they ask people who haven't paid taxes like in past 20 years, they forced them to pay taxes. And if they were not able to pay it like one time, they said, okay, you can pay it 2-3 times in 2-3 months, but you should pay it. So they're forcing everyone to pay taxes, but there is no accountability about the spending of those money. So, so the country is in a very bad situation, and everyone is paying a price for that. Like a cousin of mine was in the last year of high school, and she was planning to become a teacher. Now because she's not able to go to school, so she has got like mental issues. She has these attacks every day, His father was in security forces. Her father was in security forces. He lost his job. His brother was a journalist, lost his job. So a lot of economic problems, and at the same time, like all these women who are not able to work anymore, who are not able to be part of the society anymore. We used to call ourselves in Afghanistan, like people in my age, that we were a generation of 9/11, because that incident shaped our life and our careers. And we would always hope that there is not another 9/11 in our life, which will destroy everything, which unfortunately happened. And all this hard work of 20 years was kind of wasted. Like everyone is who went to university, into schools in this 20 years, were emigrated from the country or are trying to find a way to flee the country. And there is a big uncertainty when they leave. And if they stay, there is no hope.
So one point that you just raised now that is interesting to me is that if you're in the Taliban, you're good, right? Because you have access, you have the ability to enforce your will. You can take over a house, for example. You could take somebody's car. It's completely legal now, so to speak, by custom, to seize property, whether it's a home or cash or other types of assets. And that this is exactly how the Taliban are now sort of surviving economically themselves. So they're getting into this very interesting territory that was occupied previously by warlords that were much more loyal to the prior governments, whether it was Ghani or Karzai. And so I'm wondering, what is there going to be a tipping point where Afghan men say, to survive, we need to join up, meaning we need to just sort of become more, we also need to become enforcers in some ways of this new economy, or are there going to be splits that emerge for just regular Afghan men, where they make a decision that actually this is not a viable pathway, we can't sustain like this? Is there a prospect that you'll see some sort of resistance? I mean, I know we see pockets of it, but real resistance, in particular from Afghan men at this stage.
So we have a famous saying in Afghanistan. It says, like, when you have no choice, then you fight. And in the current situation, like in 20 years of war in Afghanistan, unfortunately, the war was kind of brought to the city. There would be an everyday suicide attack or a car bomb explosion in big cities. And people were so tired of the war, but they had enough to eat and they were able to find jobs and they were able to work. So that tiredness may continue and avoid them from fighting for a while, but there is no other choice, because if there wouldn't be any resistance against the Taliban, they would go farther. Then they would decide what color of dresses you should wear, like what day you should work, what day you should not work, where you should go, where you should not go. Like they will keep restricting it, because they think the only way to have influence and control over people is to make them fear of the group. So because of that, they're very much focused on restricting these people. And the label they have, the religion, it gives him the right. And because the society is like more than 99% Muslim, so they can't raise their voice against that, because they know that there will be circumstances and no one will question it. But like, so when someone lose everything, like their job, their income, and the situation in the families get worse, then there is no other choice. So people will start thinking about ways to fight this regime so they can have a hope for the future. Now, like, if you have money in your bank account, the Taliban has issued an order that you can collect only $400 in 1 week. And you are not allowed to transfer your money to outside of the country. So like they have control over everything. And people won't bear this long, because Afghans are very tough. Like they can survive under very hard circumstances, and like even if it is difficult to stand against the Taliban, that will accept it, and they will stand in one point.
So that then raises this question. I mean, we have not heard, Ali, about any sort of emergent new potential leaders of a resistance inside Afghanistan, other than the usual suspects. But we know the usual suspects. Maybe you can talk about some of the usual suspects. In Panjshir, there was that brief moment of resistance, but that seems to have withered away. Well, what should we expect, and why are we not hearing these rumblings of a potential for different leaders around the country, as we did, in the 1990s? One would expect to see that, or is it too soon?
I think I would make 2 points here. One is there are still like small pockets of resistance in Andhra, in Panjshir, Kapisa, and Parwan, but that is not very widespread. And one difference between now or after the events of August 2020 and 1990s is the regional dynamics. Back in 1990s, there were some regional countries or neighbors that supported the resistance alliance or front against the Taliban, but now this was not the case. That is one thing. And the second thing is that Afghans were somehow tired of the conflict and fighting over the last years due to the insurgency that the Taliban had waged against the international forces in the former government. And the third point is that I think there is like an emerging pattern of new leaders. And this is especially the women protesters that we have and the women activists that we have. And if you remember, right from the beginning of the peace process, which started with the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban in Doha, women, many Afghans, particularly women activists, always raised the alarms that the rights and the freedoms, that's where really the result or the outcome of the Afghan people's engagement with the international community or interaction could be lost. And unfortunately, those predictions have come true. And as I said earlier, there is now a massive rollback of these rights and freedoms. And we see that women have been coming out, and right from August up to now, there was also this report by the UN Secretary General that there was like a decline in women protests between September and November. That one reason was that the Taliban arrested this women activists and also tortured. And some of these women are now slowly coming back and trying to tell the accounts of the arrest and the torture. And now that the Taliban have failed to deliver on their promise to reopen schools for the secondary education, we see a new wave of the protest by girls and women activists. And I think these women activists and these women in general, they are now like the emerging leaders resisting against some of the most suppressive policy guidelines and policy notes that the Taliban are issuing to restrict their presence in the society, their life, which make life economically difficult for these people, and especially women.
So Sumaya, I'm sure you've been tracking some of these women leaders. I wonder if you could talk about, you got it. You can talk about that. And also, we've talked a lot about women. I think there was a great expectation, and we did see also that a number of minorities also have been affected by this change in governance. So when you think about sort of the landscape now in terms of the leaders that Ali has just mentioned, are there people that stand out to you that have been doing work in this area that you think is sustainable, that will have impact in terms of the protests changing the situation on the ground in Afghanistan?
Yeah. So since the Taliban took over, there have been a group of women who have been protesting on the streets. So this was even before. So there's more recently, there were girls and women who came out to protest on the streets after they did not reopen the schools. But one of the main concerns I want to raise is that a lot of these women, and eventually at some point it died down because of the fact that the Taliban were involved in detaining a lot of these women, and they were disappearing as well. And that actually I fear has played a role in sort of intimidating women, but also suppressing their opposition. There were several women who disappeared, as Ali mentioned, and were then released. And there were forced, actually, there were videos put up by the Taliban members where they forced these women, and it was very obvious that they were being forced to say that they were actually treated very well and they were treated nicely, and they were put up on social media. So there's also propaganda that is very important to be noted in the narrative that they want to show the world. And there's censorship. And that is what scares me the most, is that the information all of us right now we have is either from what we hear or what we might have seen on news media. But as media is being censored on a day by day, where BBC Pashto, Persian, and Uzbek they've stopped broadcasting, and there are other news media outlets, but also some radio stations that they banned. I'm scared that there will be less and less information about what they're actually doing on the ground with women specifically, but also minorities. So since Taliban took over, there have been mass displacement within central Afghanistan, within Hazara communities, Uzbeks and Tajiks. I myself am Uzbek. And to see that, and some of the families I've been working with some activists on the ground to deliver aid to these families who have been displaced, and they've been forcefully leave the cities that they're living in, and now they're living in tents. Some of them don't have access to even heating material, because this was during December, so winter season, when they didn't, it was very cold and they didn't have proper housing, not access to proper food. So you can only imagine what these communities are going through. But one thing I want to raise was about going back to the conversation which Fahim brought up about women. World Food Program released this new data about over 700,000 women. So Afghanistan is hosting the largest number of women who are widow. So over 700,000 women are widow in Afghanistan. And if you are now asked to have a male chaperone be with you to go anywhere, right? If you want to do any affair and you're a widow and you're the head of the household, you can only imagine, how are you going to go out? You're imprisoned. How are you going to sustain your families? And the study basically shows, I'm not sure if it was a study or research, but the data shows that these women have are more likely very difficult for them to be able to access resources and get access economic opportunities or money to sustain their families in comparison to men who are head of households. And for women, it's for women like these who are the head of the household, who are on their own and trying to survive on a daily basis. It's a sentence of imprisonment, and as Candace put it, is sentenced to death. You are just, there's not much you can do. And I'm scared that, what I'm most scared of is that as we censor media, and I think that is something we should talk about, how this is gonna impact and how we will forget and the world will forget, and the Taliban will be emboldened to take more aggressive steps and to suppress more, because there's no one holding them accountable to it.
So this is the most important question I think we need to raise here. We at New America decided to stand up the observatory in large part because our hope is that, we'll see how it goes, of course, that there is going to be a continued need amongst the diaspora in particular, because the diaspora is still connected to their families and friends that are still inside Afghanistan. And that connectivity is never going to go away. And so it's going to be really important for them to have sources of news and a dedicated news, media echelon, as it were, outside of the country. I want to talk a little bit about what has happened just to the media business in Afghanistan. And, if you haven't been to Afghanistan, in this pre-period before the Taliban, you would not necessarily know that actually Afghanistan had just an amazingly vibrant media industry that grew over time, multiple TV stations, multiple radio stations in multiple different languages, widely read, not only inside the country, but, in the region writ large, as well as, providing the world with up-to-date news. Some of the most famous, of course, is Tolo News, which is one of the largest and most prominent media outlets in the country, has made its own kind of bargain. We'll talk a little bit about that. Pajwak News, our colleagues there, now most of them live outside of Afghanistan. So let me turn to Fahim, because you are technically the journalist on our team at this moment, and talk a little bit about the pre-Taliban days of the media environment and what that was like. And then now, where are people? What is happening with newsrooms that have been essentially imploded by the situation?
So freedom of speech in Afghanistan in a pre-Taliban era was in a great shape. Like the media was very strong, and we had the capability to force government to be accountable or to share information. And the media would follow up every incident that it would kind of put the government in a position to have a statement about it. It was a decision-making factor in the government, and that they would always invite, like in the palace, the president would brief journalists. He didn't like media at all, but still, and his advisors, ministers, like it was an important instruction in the government. But after the collapse, so all of these media outlets were private, and their revenue stopped almost because they had no commercial money coming to them, or like there were many media was fed by like projects from USAID and from other American and international organizations. So that money stopped. And the strongest one, the Tolo News, they were able to keep their newsroom, but the other challenge journalists were facing was the flow of information. The Taliban's like famous spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid, when they captured Kabul, he changed his phone numbers and he was not reachable anymore. After that, like they have appointed spokesmen for every government organization, but they were not responsive. So that was another struggle for journalists. And then they were restricted from like having investigative stories, and later on, like they were buried from broadcasting. BBC and like Voice of America, which was also a revenue source for them. So currently, like many of my journalist friends who are still working in media, they haven't get paid for like 4 or 5 months. And I was talking to one of them the other day. He said, like, I can't bring any bread to my family members, and no one is giving me any loan anymore because I have been asking for this for a long time. Another journalist friend started working in a street side restaurant. Like, typically he's a vendor and he's trying to sell something and make some money. So it like the freedom of speech is no more there, and the environment for working is not available. It is just some of the international media outlets that the Taliban shows some flexibility toward them, but they they don't have Afghan journalists. They only have some translators with them who can help with the translation. But it's a bit difficult to tell the whole story because the society is very complicated, and it is difficult for another journalist to come from overseas and tell the story. So I think the freedom of speech and media in Afghanistan was one of the biggest achievements of past 20 years, which is not more any there.
So that brings us to a last question before we open up to Q&A, because I think we have, still plenty of time for that now. What should be done? I mean, we have probably maybe hundreds of journalists, definitely thousands of journalists and human rights defenders. You know, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, of course, was forced to close. Many of those folks have been displaced. Some of them are here in the United States, some of them are in Canada and Europe, et cetera. But those organizations, they still exist in skeleton form. Some of them are reforming, right? What do we see over the next, let's say, year or 2 years for both media outlets that have this alternative outside presence, and then some of these human rights organizations that have an alternative presence outside of the country? What should they do? What will they be doing over the next couple of years, Ali?
Yeah, thank you. Before coming to this question, I would add a couple of points about your previous question. The Taliban, as they have restricted women's presence in society, they have also issued some guidelines that have restricted the freedom of press in Afghanistan. At least they have issued 3 major guidelines. One was on 19 September, this was issued by Taliban's interim director for government media and information center. And that somehow required the media to work with that center and coordinate their detailed reports with that media. That is basically establishing a kind of process where the Taliban could impose censorship on media. And the second guideline was issued by the Taliban's Ministry of Information and Culture. And that guideline required the media organization in Afghanistan to call the Taliban by their full name. That means implying that they should recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government. They require the media to call them Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Some media organizations have tried to deal with the Taliban and call them, but others so far have resisted. And the third guideline was issued later on. This was by the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, and it mainly banned certain foreign shows on Afghan TV channels, and also banned like the role of women in TV shows. So that is like restricting media, and that has like a practical implication on TV channels as well, because some of them relied on running ads, commercial. And the second point is that the Taliban, there have been at least 2 reports. One is by the UN Secretary General in late January, in which he said that UNAMOD documented like 44 cases of arrest, detention, and violence against journalists since 15 August 2021. And most of these cases were attributed to Taliban, like 42 cases. And but there was another report by the organizations Reporters Without Border, which said that it had documented like 50 cases of detention and arrest of journalists, media workers, and this detention like lasted between hours up to 1 week. And often this detention or arrest were accompanied by violence against this journalists. And of course, you might have seen that 2 of the Itlaat Rus is one of the famous media dailies in Afghanistan that also achieved the award for anti-corruption award. And 2 of their journalists were arrested and beaten, and one of them even lost, for example, the hearings due to this torture. But now looking forward, I think if because of the attention is somehow diverted to other places, and probably the pressure is also somehow continues to decrease on the Taliban, and it is likely that the situation for media in Afghanistan will continue to shrink, or the space will continue to shrink for media and journalists. But as you mentioned, there is like a huge number of journalists who are now based outside. I think they could play a very supportive role for the people who are inside, the journalists who are inside, and then they can, if the stories that cannot be told by journalists who are inside the country could be somehow told by the journalists and human rights defenders outside the country.
That's going to be necessary. I think, and I hope that the American community of journalists and the industries here, as well as in Europe and the United Kingdom, they have to recognize that the situation calls now for our community to kind of step forward and support journalists outside, because ultimately they're supporting journalists inside, and these stories still need to be told. So it looks like we might have some time for Q&A here, and I think we maybe even have some lined up on Zoom, some questions. I'll let you give us the guidance.
Okay, that's better. We have 2 online questions. As Taliban apply many restrictions on Afghan media and journalists, but on the other hand, international journalists go to Afghanistan and somehow the Taliban have good behavior with them. So how do you observe this policy of the Taliban?
Really interesting question. So this double standard essentially, and I mean, I will add an additional question, which is what should American, European, British journalists who are there do now? Should they be cooperating with the Taliban given circumstances, or should there be a different kind of approach that creates more solidarity? Let me start with Sumaya and then come down the line.
Yeah, so this question actually reminds me about this one journalist who was I think pregnant, and she was stuck in Afghanistan, and I think she expressed her positive experience with the Taliban, and made that this was in the news. I believe she was Australian, but I might be wrong. I don't remember which country, but most likely Australia, New Zealand, one of them. And I remember reading that article, and there was a huge outrage by Afghan community and journalists, because in a way, her narrative was normalizing actually a lot of the actions by the Taliban, but also shedding good light on them. I think for journalists, it's important, and it's their responsibility as a foreign journalist. If you are in Afghanistan, you have to be cognizant and not contribute in normalizing violence or shedding a positive light on Taliban just because you've had a good experience. You need to acknowledge first that it's your experience and it's specifically towards you. And I think my main concern would be about what narrative foreign journalists will put out to the world, because they are the ones who have the privilege and the access. And sadly, many qualified journalists who are sitting here and my colleagues who are on Zoom, who have been in exile, cannot go back and have had to leave in such desperate situations. And it's not that they wanted to leave. They had it's not that they wanted to, they were forced to leave because they were scared for their life. And we can see how difficult it has become and how difficult it is for Afghan journalists to be able to do the work they want to do. So as foreign journalists, I hope that they can be more responsible and also hold the Taliban accountable and not paint a narrative that is not true to Afghans.
That's a dilemma, isn't it, Fahim?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that New York Times, they still have a bureau open. They have new staff who are working because they don't have the profile that you had, for instance, right? That they're not as well known, and so perhaps the Taliban will give them a little bit of leeway. I mean, in your close circles, you must be discussing this on some level. What about your foreign colleagues who are there now reporting on Afghanistan? The New York Times is a little bit different than maybe some other organizations, but give us a sense of sort of what the dilemmas are that you see.
So the Taliban are trying to show the world that they are changed and they are better people now. And the best tool for that is inexperienced Western journalists, because they will just report whatever they see. When my country collapsed, I saw one of the Western journalists who have been living for quite a while in Afghanistan, that he wrote on his Twitter that it was very safe to walk in streets of Kabul and there was no worry, and he was enjoying this security. During that week, 2 journalists from Itlaat Rose were beaten so badly that I have their pictures. They were tortured. And the main reason for that was because they were Hazara. And they were covering a protest of women. The problem with Western journalists in Afghanistan is that when they have a privilege that they're enjoying and it's coming from the Taliban, they kind of turn a blind eye toward other miseries that the people are experiencing. So if they're giving an access, they're not quite committed to journalism principles to say, like, I had this privilege because I was a Western, and the Taliban are trying their hard to have legitimacy from West and have their regime recognized by West. But they report it as they see it, and unfortunately, there's no space for investigation and for reporting. And like when they go to a Taliban unit, and if whatever they are doing, they will just photograph that, and the Taliban can stage that 1 or 2 hours when they're there. Like they will train their fighters how to treat with the journalists. But that's not the case. And unfortunately, no one is trying to follow that up for a couple of days. If they're reporting on a Taliban unit securing a neighborhood, they will just report on those 2 hours they spend there, and they will not go and ask the people in the neighborhood. And even if they ask, like, people are so much scared of the Taliban because they have no mercy on anyone. And violence is the way they're very much used to it for 20 years. And they think they have the right to kill, beat, torture whoever they want. So the reports which are coming from Afghanistan through the international media, most of them are not properly investigated, and they're not written in a way that it should be. It's just they're witness of like a short time there, and it is not investigated later on that what happened and how this thing is going on.
Dangerous environment. I'm sure we have other questions.
Are there ways to get information into Afghanistan by radio, internet, or satellite?
Great question. I mean, I think we were discussing this also last night, which is, what is the capacity that the Taliban has for shutting down the internet, controlling information in and out? Ali, you were talking a little bit about this.
Yeah, as far as I know that because, as Candice mentioned earlier, that many media outlets have shut down and many journalists have left the country, and actually there is still no clear statistics on that because people are still waiting to leave the country, and more and more media organizations are being closed down in the country. And some of the editor-in-chiefs of some famous dailies and media outlets that have left the country, they have tried to register their organizations outside the country. But there is like this concern that if the Taliban so far we have like radios, access through radios and also dailies and TV channels, and also online platforms that provide this information and news stories. But there is this concern that if the Taliban decide to shut down internet, and then it will be a real problem, especially for the journalists who are based outside and want to play a supportive role for the people who are inside. And this especially came, this concern especially came out after, for example, Taliban's acting interior minister was ridiculed on social media because in one ceremony he recited the words of Holy Quran wrongly, and social media activists and users on Facebook and Twitter somehow mocked him because they were saying that these people like carried out suicide attacks or other bombings across the country over the last 20 years in the name of Holy Quran or so-called jihad, but now they cannot really recite the words of Holy Quran. But that is really a real concern that if, and the other point is that this social media is also a source of news for media outlets because people when they see something by the Taliban behavior treatment, they could probably furtively record those behaviors and post it on social media, on Facebook. And also they can provide it to journalists through communication applications like WhatsApp, Signals. But if the internet is shut down, then we will lose all those means of communications and source of news. And the other point is that if that happens, then those who can provide like stories or tell the stories from outside, then the people inside the country will not be able to have those stories.
That's interesting. I know we have lots of questions here. I'll just comment and just say, I think, you know, it would take a great deal of sophistication on the part of the Taliban to be able to turn off the internet. We don't see that they have that kind of level of sophistication and technical expertise. If they did get it, they probably would get it from another country. That country would most likely be Pakistan. There might be others that would be motivated to assist with that. And so then that leads to another question, just from a policy perspective, the what if, you know, what if it turns out, you know, Pakistan lends that kind of expertise to the new Afghan government. What should the US do? It still has a relationship with Pakistan, or if it's another government that does that. Please, next question.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. This is Tasneem from Palestine. I'm a TV journalist and Humphrey Fellow. I wanted to share with you, thank you for coming first and sharing the stories from Afghanistan. I wanted to share with you my knowledge about the Afghanistan. It was started in 2010 when I became a radio unit coordinator in my country. And I went to the BBC platforms, and there is a section for Afghan folks, a 15-minute drama. And that brought for me a knowledge about Afghanistan and the heritage, culture. Many of these stories, it's so beautiful. And many of them also, it's really, it brings the tears for me because the human situation there. Then in 2022, I met Fatima Ahmadi in DC, Global Leadership Forum. And I feel like, oh my God, she is a bank information for me to know what's the situation with the women in Afghanistan now. And she brought for me many, many knowledge and knowledge about the situation there. So I have a question. If the Taliban now not interested at all in the Western Union or in the Western countries, could, for example, with the large number of the widows in Afghanistan, could non-profit organizations from the region, that Islamic or Arabs, or the people that can at least Taliban interest in, bring some hope for these women in the Afghanistan? Could that make a tricky way that they can help women in that area? Thank you. Sumaya, if you want to answer.
Actually, I'm currently involved in some of these conversations. So I will just say that the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, they did make a statement and condemned the Taliban. Well, they said that girls deserve education and they should be allowed to go to school, but there is some level of hesitancy from Islamic states in terms of how they respond to the Taliban, especially when Pakistan is, leading, and there's, political history between Pakistan and the Taliban. It's quite difficult for these Islamic states to go out front and condemn the Taliban because they also don't want to strain their relationships. And so, yes, there are a lot of conversations for there are active efforts by international organizations who are trying to mediate conversation between the OIC. The good news is that there will be a special rapporteur appointed for Afghanistan. And today is March 30th. So I think he should be appointed today or tomorrow. And I've been involved in that process of like monitoring the 49th Human Rights council session right now happening in Geneva. And so there is a lot of effort in trying to support Afghan women and finding avenues. I think the difficult part here is, even if we engage with the Taliban on this, after what happened on March 23rd, when there were people, moderate Taliban members who assured that the schools would be open, and then the hardline Taliban members at the very last minute were like, no, still there are other Islamic aspects of Sharia that we need to, for these girls to comply by, that needs to be done. But then there's, I think, a question of that I'm scared about is that, is it really truly like the conservative Taliban members believe that girls should not go to education? And as much as I did not want to, believe in this, I'm starting to believe that no, they have not changed at all. And now it's like very, very difficult to fight this battle. So there are people who are within the Taliban, some leaders who are very hardline and believe that girls should not go to school. And there are moderates who want girls to go back to school because there is a large support among Afghans for girls to go back to school. So it's going to be tough because they all have to now negotiate, and we have to see who wins, right? And I'm hoping that the resistance, the protests that the girls do, and the pressure that the international community can push, the OIC, but the UN, the Human Rights Council, they need to hold them accountable so that there are ways that we can ensure that these girls go back to school. So there are a lot of efforts, but again, there's a lot of internal politics involved, and it is difficult to make movement, and people are working on it at the moment. Yeah.
Limitations on the external change, I think, is the answer there. Please.
Hi, my name is Milana. I am a Chechen journalist from Russia. I am a BBC Russian service correspondent. And I have actually different questions to all of you. And my first question would be to Fahim. What do you think, actually to all of you, if you want to answer, what do you think if the Taliban, like, because of all the situation in Ukraine and the whole world is like paying attention to that war, don't you think that Taliban can use this advantage and move on, for example, toward Tajikistan or something else?
So the Taliban always say that they're Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So they won't threaten any neighboring country. And I don't see any sign of that because they're not a group who want to have, like at least for now, who want to have a territorial control over the neighboring countries. And they're not in a good shape financially to do that. But they will use this opportunity to strengthen in their control over people in Afghanistan and over the government, because they are an ideology that is like a constitution, which first form of that mention, it's not changeable. So the Taliban ideology is also not changeable. That they are hardline, and as long as they want to be the Taliban, they should be this way. If they change, then they won't be the Taliban. So that they will use this time to have more control and to kind of blackmail the international society through restricting women and people in the country to have an international recognition. And after that, it will be like a kind of closed government that will dictate whatever they want to the countrymen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is an interesting question, I think. As you were talking, and I think your question is very interesting. I was sort of casting forward in my mind and thinking about imagine a world in which perhaps there is some sort of shift and the Taliban is forced to come to the table on a number of these questions about repression. Come to the table with who? Well, come to the table with perhaps diaspora who are outside the country, come to the table with folks inside the country who are mounting this resistance. Okay, imagine that situation where actually a bargaining has to begin simply because the misery is just too much for people to take anymore. I wonder what lessons Afghans from this 9/11 generation would apply then in that situation. Because, you know, the last time around we saw constitutional loya jirgas, right? That was the big obsession. Clearly that didn't work. We saw, you know, an insistence on electoral rights that were not in any way bound to a census, right, of the population. So we saw a lot of mistakes happening for that 9/11 generation. And I wonder if given the opportunity to negotiate with the Taliban now, what lesson, one lesson would you apply? What one mistake that you would not repeat again? Let me start with Ali.
I think that is a very difficult question. One thing is that Afghanistan is a very diverse society, multi-ethnic society, and this ethnicity in the country has been politicized. So ethnicity is very has a very salient role in Afghanistan in politics. And the one lesson that could be is that to start as a inclusive political process as possible, because there is this criticism of the Bonn Agreement or the Bonn Conference back in 2001, that it somehow failed to include the remnants of the Taliban or the Taliban leaders, of course, but there has also been this counter argument that even if the Taliban had been included, whether there would not have been a start of insurgency, given that there is a dimension of proxy to the Taliban, that they serve as a proxy for the neighboring country. But I think with all those questions, still the best way is to start as inclusive political process as possible. And this inclusive political process should somehow discuss or have a dialogue and open conversation about the governance, about the fundamental rights and freedom. And even, for example, nowadays there is this question or discussion about engagement with the Taliban and even recognition of the Taliban in such a diverse and plural, this is very plural and deeply divided society. Even if you, of course, engagement for the sake of delivering humanitarian assistance would be important and necessary, but recognition, I think recognition of a group that want to exercise totalitarian power in such a diverse society, I always wonder whether that could be like a practical solution for the country. If that cannot be a practical solution for such a society, then the country will continue to be unstable and a source of threat for other countries and international security.
So just to clarify, you're saying the Taliban should be recognized, or that will then precipitate more stability, or to recognize them really will accelerate instability?
No, I think if you recognize the Taliban, it cannot be a solution to the problem.
Mm-hmm. And my question would be to the Sumaya and Ali. What do men feel about all these restrictions for women in Afghanistan? I know that you say that they are not happy that they have to go to all these places like store, market, and do all the document things that they before never did. But I'm asking more about the women's rights. Do they support women about their rights to not like wear that they don't want to wear, or they act like usually men act in that kind of place? I know because I myself from the patriarchal Muslim place, and I know that men usually support this kind of restrictions. So yeah, women have to wear hijab, women have to stay at home and all these things. But maybe in Afghanistan, it's different.
Yeah, I can go with that. I think it's really hard to generalize and say, oh, all Afghan men are like that, or all Afghan men are like that. But I think it's very important to highlight that what we're seeing right now in Afghanistan, since happening in August 15, life was completely different before that. The 20 years of progress that we saw, women were in a lot of political positions. They were involved in civil society. They were leading organizations. They were working outside. And there were families who were encouraging their daughters to go to school. More recently, I was reading reports by Human Rights Watch, but also other organizations who released reports about surveying families about their responses in terms of girls not being able to go back to school. And one of the families that they interviewed, one of the father, he had worked very hard for his daughters for him to afford to send his daughters to school, and wanted to ensure all of his daughters can get education. Because in many ways, and I will speak to this, is that when you're living in unstable situation and instability and conflict, for a lot of kids, education is a way of escape. It was for me. And the reason why I value it so much is that it gave me sort of a pathway to sort of get myself out of this perpetuous cycle that I found, whether that was being in situation of conflict and be able to go and experience life, what it's like to have peace and stability. And many fathers, many brothers, and many men in the country, there are many men out there in Afghanistan who want that for their daughter and for women in Afghanistan. So I won't generalize and say, no, there's none, because for the past 20 years, that's what we were seeing. So it's wrong when the media portrays it in a way where it's like, no, it's the society, Afghans think like that, their mentality is like that. No, there are a lot of Afghans who go against this narrative. But then obviously there are certain parts of Afghanistan that are very, very conservative, where women are treated as, and we were having this conversation yesterday, where it's an aspect of honor, preserving the family's honor, and what would the society say. So there are a lot of factors like that as well, which leads to a lot of conservatism and concerns for sending their daughters to school. But one of the main reasons why many in the past 20 years, because I've been involved in this education sector, one of the studies showed that one of the main reasons why girls didn't go to school was security. So the main concern were family, it wasn't ideology per se, it was actually concern of the family that their girls, it was not safe for them to go to school. So safety is the main concern when it comes to education for families for considering to send their daughters. So I think there's a huge support within the country for sending daughters to school. It's just that those voices are being now marginalized and are at the intersection. And it's important that we provide place and opportunity for such men to come out and to also start that resistance towards this, because we need those men when these women are being marginalized. So I'm hopeful that more and more Afghan men will speak out, and they will join the resistance with the women.
Thank you. I believe we are actually at time. One more question, we got it.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Fahim Hussain from School of Future of Innovation in Society. The Chinese foreign minister visited Afghanistan last week or the week before. It was fascinating to see how, as the things are panning out in Ukraine and Russia, China started having inroads and being very comfortable with the present regime there. So you had a question about the capability of internet shutdown. Pakistan has done it successfully over the years. Even India has capability of doing that. In South Asia, we are very infamous of doing like shutting things down. So the capabilities are there. And then China is very much famous for all this surveillance tech. So I'm just imagining, I would love to have your insights on two things. One, how do you see China expand's role in Afghanistan right now, and how they can help to normalize Taliban with the rest of, their own clique? And China has a huge clique right now. So how you imagine that plays out? And more specifically, in terms of the freedom of expression space, how do you think Afghans can, like the present Afghan regime, can actually get some knowledge transfer from China? Both are very grim questions.
Great question. I will answer just partly in the interest of time, but also because this is something that at New America, we are really thinking a lot about sort of this, this challenge that we see between a divided world, an authoritarian and democratic government. In some ways, it's a little bit of a false dichotomy, because we know even in the United States that democratic principles are deeply challenged right now with voting rights, with access to all kinds of things that are necessary, protection of rights. We're seeing some issues. January 6th is a very good example of how troubled our own democracy is. So there's no bright line here. I just want to be very clear about that up front. However, China does represent, I think, a new version of authoritarianism that shows a deep cohesion of power and an ability to then project that power outward up to a point. On the Afghanistan question, we know that China was extremely important for the negotiated bargain between the United States and the Taliban. Without those open doors, the Taliban, of course, traveled to China, to Beijing. Starting in roughly 2013-14, we began to hear these reports about delegations going to Beijing, and then Beijing sending people to Doha, et cetera, et cetera. China, I think the way to think about China is sort of the how and then the why, right? The how is very simple, to continue its sort of cultivation of powers that are in opposition to democratic principles more generally. And then, of course, powers that clearly are making a concerted effort to challenge the US paradigm, right? The rules-based order that the United States has been responsible for championing for the last 75 years, and clearly has sort of abdicated its responsibility there. So that, we should expect that that will continue, that China sees that this is an important moment for it to assert itself in the region. I don't think, though, we will see China with boots on the ground anytime soon, because it doesn't need to do that. Economically, what's important for China, and this is the why piece, is to open up that passageway between China, India, Pakistan, and westward through Afghanistan to Iran, and further on in Central Asia, and then onward to Europe. This is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. We don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if China makes the kind of level of investment that it has in places like Pakistan, in Afghanistan. We know that they've failed on a number of levels with their extractive industry enterprises. The copper mine, most famously at Ainak, didn't go so well for them. It's very difficult. They're having a hard time getting that copper out of the mine and then to market. And there continues to be issues with that. But what we do know about Afghanistan that's very important for China as well as the world is that it is very resource rich with rare earths, particularly in the southeastern quadrant of the country. There were all these theories back in 2010 that the US Marines being in Helmand was somehow related to the rare earths that were there. I don't think so. Unfortunately, the United States government is not that smart. So I think the motivation for China is to continue to make sure that even if it can't extract from Afghanistan, that those, rare earths and that value, that nobody else can do so. And then so keeping the Taliban in place kind of ensures that, essentially. I think that's the motivation. And I think the transfer of expertise, I think that's quite right. Although I would expect to see it first to come from Pakistan, simply because the kind of cultural overlap and the kind of pre-existing relationships are there. And in any case, Pakistan got it from China, right? So, well, I want to thank you all for your attendance, your interest, and so forth. And thank you, Juan, for inviting us here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for being here today. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you tomorrow morning. And you have open doors at the Cronkite School, so please stay in touch. Thank you for everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you back here in the forum tomorrow for Symbiosis, a joint project between ASU and Revista Gato Pardo from Mexico City. Good night.